Great. Thank you again for joining us. We'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of those who are joining us from across the globe. I'm Andrew Sinclair, the Senior Advisor at Dexis' Center for Global Security and Stabilization. And I want to thank you for attending this discussion today. We're here, for the 9th installment of this Dialogues with Dexis series. And it's a series where we bring together a diverse group of practitioners, policymakers, and experts to discuss emerging trends and innovations on a range of topics in conflict prevention, stabilization, governance, and global security. And so I encourage you to view our past Dialogues with Dexis on our website at dexisonline.com. Today's discussion is called Time to Talk Trauma, moving toward a trauma-responsive approach in international development. Given the scale, horror, and brutality of today's wars and protracted conflicts, this discussion is long overdue. For too long, we failed to recognize the impacts of trauma on our work, on our partners, and our staff. And since programming in conflict is no longer the exception, but rather it constitutes the majority of US foreign assistance, both development and humanitarian, we must do a better job recognizing and responding to how trauma manifests itself in our programs. And this topic is near to me. Like many of you who've worked in the field on humanitarian, stabilization, peace building, or transition programs, violent conflict and the compounding psychological, emotional, and physical trauma it produces is inescapable. It is the air that we breathe and the reality of our staff and our partners. And that line between their lives and work is blurred. And we've seen these burdens carried by communities, families, and individuals as they navigate and move on through conflict. So let's ask ourselves, are we doing enough as a community, both as practitioners and donors, to account for and manage the impacts of violent conflict on our work? And we hope today's discussion can surface some practical ways to move beyond just trauma awareness to trauma-responsive approaches in our programs. But first, I'd like to go over a few admin items. Today's conversation will last approximately 1 hour. Each speaker will have 10 minutes to speak. And we encourage the audience to submit your questions at any time using the Q&A function. And for those of you attending, there's no need to come on camera, and you can even submit your questions anonymously, so don't be shy. And we really want this to be a lively and engaging discussion. So we hope you can have some thoughtful questions to drive the Q&A portion, which will come after our final speaker finishes. Now, it's my privilege to introduce our panelists, who will each offer valuable and rich perspectives on this topic. First is Dr. Angi Yoder-Maina, who brings 3 decades of experience working in conflict-affected countries. She is the Director of Trauma and Resilience at Florida State University. She's also the founder and director of the Green String Network, an NGO that facilitates an understanding of trauma's effects to develop communal strategies for sustained healing and reconciliation. Next, we have Patricia Dorsher, a senior manager at Global Communities. She's a seasoned humanitarian and development professional with expertise in program design, grant management, business development, and partnerships, who has worked with donors to provide emergency programming in Syria, Ukraine, Lebanon, and Palestine. And finally, we have Yasar Fattoom, a senior transition advisor and deputy country representative for the USAID OTI Iraq program. He has over 10 years of experience in USAID OTI project management with a focus on transitioning and fragile environments. So we're so lucky to have you all here today. And first, I'd like to hand the mic to Dr. Angi to walk us through her perspectives on the intersection between trauma and peace building. So over to you. Thank you.
Thanks. Can you see everything?
Yeah, got
All
you.
right. Wonderful. So, oh no, my computer keeps beeping at me, so I hope we're going to go without the beeps. Why are we here today? Well, today trauma is a buzzword within the stabilization development field, but at the same time, it's becoming recognized as a critical element. What we'd like to do is talk more about, or I'm really interested in talking more about that intersection of trauma and our work in stabilization, peace building, governance, and development. As Andrew said, more and more of our work is focused in conflict countries, and it's now the norm and not the exception. So I like to start always with a metaphor: consider a cracked cup for the communities that are the communities you work in. Just as a cracked cup leaks when filled with water, communities affected by chronic violence, mistrust, abuse, neglect experience similar leaks, and they can't hold the resources that we're putting into them. These cracks evident in the communities worldwide hinder progress. In my experience as a peace-building practitioner, issues like colonialism, corruption, winner-takes-all politics, violence during elections, and violent extremism exacerbate these conflicts, these cracks. Despite the significant investment in development and security, the cracks persist and deepen. This phenomenon is rooted in the deep intergenerational, cultural, social, and political trauma that communities who have been in conflict continue to carry with them. So I'm not saying that this new term trauma is the primary cause of these cracks, but I believe it obstructs our ability to repair them, fostering feelings of hopelessness, isolation, anger, and blame for those who are the cup, but also the outsiders who are pouring in the resources. As Judah Krishnamurti observed, being well adjusted in a sick society isn't a sign of health. And Dr. Christina Bethel further noted that we're living in a trauma-organized society. Recognizing and addressing trauma's impact is vital for effective stabilization, peace building, governance, and development efforts. Just a quick note, my addressing is bolded and capitalized in my notes because in recent years, our industry has finally begun to acknowledge the link of trauma, but we've yet to find systemic ways to address the daunting and pervasive nature of trauma in our work. I don't know if I need this. One of my people who looked at my slides said I didn't really need this, but I just put it in there to say some people can be triggered by visual images. I have one watercolor that's quite striking, will depict some violence. All of us and many of us in this room have been in violent situations, so I like to give people a heads up. If you're upset by any of the images, reach out to a friend or even me later today if you want to talk about what came up for you. So what is trauma? I like to get us all on the same page. I use Gabor Mate's definition that trauma is not what happened to you, it's what happens inside of you as a result of what happened to you. So we all experience similar events differently. It's our internal processing. But the important thing is that it changes perceptions of safety, relationship, and identity. And all of these are things that we need for recovery of societies after conflict, for restoring people's faith in institutions. This is why trauma matters from this definition, in my opinion. Chronic violence resulting from civil war, political unrest, and clan disputes, violent extremism profoundly impacts the psychological well-being of individuals in conflict zones. In a recent training session in Mogadishu, one of the participants asked the question, does just surviving equate to resilience? The challenge we face are twofold. Trauma not only results from instability, but it perpetuates it, affecting governance structures like justice systems, security apparatuses, and recovery efforts. Active participation from communities is not just crucial in the work that we do, but it's necessary for stabilizing Communities, both those from the community need the community participation, but also us as outsiders need community participation to advance peace building and restore governance. So while conventional analysis focuses on visible factors like politics and economics, the profound impact of extreme violence, abuse, neglect, and marginalization on a nation's collective psyche is very much overlooked. Like I said at the very beginning, trauma today is a buzzword within our work and our field, while at the same time, it is beginning to have more recognition. In the early 2000s, I'd run around the hallways of USAID Kenya, and people would see me coming and know I was the trauma lady, and they didn't want to talk to me because that's all I could talk to them about. But I'm no longer the trauma lady. I want to be the healing lady, because I want to move this to a strength-based approach and not just focus on the deficit. So many practitioners continue to question the effectiveness of traditional approaches when faced with the stark reality of our work. Wounded leaders, structural inequities, unaddressed trauma, and unaddressed conflict hinder our progress. And while some efforts combine peace building with mental health and psychosocial support, integration remains fragmented and usually elements added sporadically rather than consistently. We use a healing-centered approach, which acknowledges the complexity of chronic violence, understanding that damaged systems hinder recovery efforts. It focuses on mitigating the impact of violence by integrating trauma awareness, knowledge, and skills into organizational cultures, practices, and policies. So the awareness is just the piece. The responsiveness is the skills and the organizational cultural change. However, mainstreaming this idea has led to trauma-informed approach being a series of checklists, adding more stress to already strained staff in toxic environments. By broadening the scope of trauma responsiveness, a healing-centered perspective embraces community-centered healing practices that foster resilience, strength, and crucially healing. And you can't get into this in 10 minutes, but this is real and it can work, but you have to invest in it. The shift entails moving from asking what's wrong with you, which is often what we ask, to what happened to you, which is a trauma-informed question. But ultimately, a more affirming stance is, who are you? What's right with you? And what's right with your community? This change emphasizes a positive strength-based approach, recognizing individuals and communities for their resilience and well-being, transcending mere trauma-informed practices to become truly healing-centered. So as I conclude in my last couple minutes, I have 3 short recommendations. The first is we have to start talking about social healing in these environments, in our field, as a foundation for all the other work that we do, whether it's economic development, stabilization, peace building, governance, development. This is a foundation, and we have to start to build it into our programs. If healing is engaged, peace works better, development's real, and governments begin to function. Secondly, we have to prepare the peace builders and the people in our workforce, not just the peace builders, the people in our workforce to face trauma in their work. Helping them develop embodied practices so they can tap into them later when they need them is critical. I can help you find resources for that. And lastly, we need to understand that the organizations working in this field have been impacted by the trauma that's very present in their field. Helping our workforce understand and our organizations understand how to work in and lead healing-centered organizations will go so far in supporting us as we do our work. And I also believe we'll begin to transform this field, which probably needs some transformation. So it's great hope that all of us working in chronic violent environments will begin to understand the impact of trauma, and that the impact of trauma are not mental illnesses, but normal survival responses to violence, abuse, inequity, and marginalization. And by ignoring it and doing nothing, it's not our answer. In the early 2000s, that was the answer I got over and over. Because if our symptoms are left unaddressed, these symptoms become not only mental illnesses, but will negatively impact the larger society and impact the ability to recover. In order to do something about trauma, systems and organizations must change. It's no longer an option to ignore the issues and not to act. We need to heal our cracks before we can move forward. And I believe healing is possible.
Great. Thank you so much for that. There is, I think, a lot in there that I know we'd all love to follow up on, but appreciate you condensing that down into such manageable sort of chunks. And I really want to highlight, the sort of move from, this resilience-based move from a sort of negative-based approach to a resilience-based approach, because I think that's a theme that's going to come across through a lot of the speakers. So thank you. So next, we'd like to turn to Patricia, who will reflect on global communities' work managing trauma, and she'll really discuss some of the operational realities, both in fragile and conflict affected areas. So over to you, Patricia.
Great, thank you, Andrew. And thank you, Dr. Angi, for that really interesting presentation as well. I see a lot of kind of common themes and places where we can, build off of each other as well. So as Andrew mentioned, I'd like to take kind of a more operational, practitioner-focused approach to discussing the trauma-informed approaches, because that's where it becomes trauma responsive, is in the work of going into the operations. So I think, first of all, it's just useful to remind ourselves of the context in which we are trying to apply, such approaches. We are doing hard work in hard places. So you're frequently in fragile or conflict affected states. You have to navigate multiple spheres of complexity just to even successfully show up for your program. It can be uncertain political environments and shifting power dynamics, formal and informal economy and currency fluctuation, socioethnic divides, gender norms. There's layer upon layer of complexity in the areas in which we work. On top of that, you're bringing in a complex project team that has a variety of competencies. So typically COPs or project leaders are usually technical experts in their area of specialization, an engineer, an epidemiologist, depending on what area you're looking at. Country directors are often generalists, and national staff or people who have come on specifically for the response, particularly in early days of a response to a conflict, are often coming in from very different sectors and may or may not have different levels of understanding of these types of approaches that we try to espouse within our work. Pardon me. On top of that, you're often working with local partners who are, sometimes civil society organizations that have not always been an entirely welcome part of civil society, potentially with authorities, just kind of depending on the context itself, or have limited experience working in this new type of environment. So it's navigating a lot of different players coming from a lot of different places with a variety of understanding of the complexities they're in. Also within this work, there are a multitude of cross-cutting issues that practitioners are expected to pay attention to and embed within their programming, leading to a little bit of a feeling of trying to be everything to everyone, everywhere, all at the same time. This includes trauma-informed approaches, conflict sensitivity, do no harm, safe and accountable programming, gender equality and social inclusion, diversity, equity, inclusion, localization, decentralization, decolonization, the list goes on. But all of these lenses and all of these issues have a common thread underlying them, which is, how do we program, how do we do work in a way that is sensitive to the human lived experience within a given context? While there is this underlying question and underlying connection, there's very little guidance given to project teams to incorporate all of these necessary cross-cutting approaches. And it can be very overwhelming very quickly. While also trying to incorporate these themes and ideas into programming, we have to recognize that there are certain things that are within our control and certain things that are not within our control. particularly within fragile and conflict affected states, these contexts are often highly politicized, and stakeholder power dynamics can really limit your ability to control the way in which your program is implemented. For example, in situations where the majority funding comes from government sources, which is very common in a lot of these areas, it's often accompanied with a foreign policy objective. This kind of politicization of assistance can be a limitation on decision-making that is related to adaptation that could help help inform trauma responsive approaches. It also can create blinders that end up enabling trauma and failing to recognize it within programming and organizations. So going from that, I want to just kind of, with this context, kind of provide some insight into how global communities works with trauma-informed approaches within our projects and also within our organization, because I think it's important to look at those two things, you kind of both through the project cycle and then also with an organizational foundation to see where things are responsive or not. So for us, our focus on TIA and other cross-cutting or technical areas is not necessarily about telling staff or partners what to do or how to do it, but instead on providing them information and analytical frameworks that enable a baseline understanding of the concept and a shared understanding of that concept, and then supporting a localized analysis that is relevant to the context in which they're working. Global Communities is an organization that works in both humanitarian assistance and in development. So in our humanitarian assistance programming, this is frequently done through our safe and accountable programming assessments, protection risk analysis, and safeguarding assessments. Those are infused with trauma-informed approaches. We also tend towards multi-sectoral approaches and programming that include cross-cutting protection programming at the kind of the bottom two layers of the IASC MHPSS intervention pyramid, for those who are familiar. So focusing on basic services and security and community and family support categories. Within our development programming, this idea of TIA is introduced through immediately in the design phase and then kind of hard-coded into the intended results. So our M&E teams and learning teams, as well as our, GESI, I didn't look up our acronym for gender empowerment, youth, and social inclusion teams are engaged in all proposals from the beginning. And in particular, our MELI team is really consistent about bringing approaches that are that included complexity aware monitoring and our assessments upfront. And our GESI teams really help us think through the inclusion of marginalized populations throughout the project cycle. So to look at a couple of specific examples, we, like any organization, we have varying degrees of success in applying TIA in our projects, moving towards responsive approaches, and it varies across the project, across the context. So one specific example that I want to mention is we have a project called the Social Cohesion and Reconciliation Activity. It's a USAID funded project in Sri Lanka. And the aim of this project is to increase resilience to social, economic, and political shocks and stressors in a way that fosters reconciliation among diverse populations. So the way in which we use TIA within this project is that we took an approach that recognized the differences in the wartime experiences, in the post-conflict social dynamics, and in the priorities of different populations at a community level. And that enabled us to have really localized approaches within communities of dealing with in working towards resilience and social cohesion post-conflict. So with this, we also have a result focusing specifically on resilience that's designed to address trauma by increasing awareness and access to MHPSS services for underserved, marginalized, and vulnerable groups. And so then that's where this localized approach is layered with an actual result in the program to ensure that we are really trying to be trauma responsive throughout the project. Another place where we've really thought about this is in Ukraine, where we have both humanitarian assistance and development projects. So prior to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we had been implementing a USAID funded program called Dobre, which is a decentralization program in which we were working with a number of local governments across the country. This project, once the invasion happened, was quickly expanded, extended, and scaled up with a focus on emergency response. There was a lot of pressure to move quickly, as there is in any emergency response area. But the communities that we were working with prior to the expansion of the conflict really liked the approach that we had been taking with them. They liked those established practices, and they wanted to continue those. So to ensure that we didn't undermine their sense of empowerment and agency, we did stick with this more participatory approach that may have ended up being slightly slower, but really listened to what the communities were asking for and saying they needed in this time of acute stress. Similarly, excuse me, I've got a little bit of a cold. We have a BHA-funded humanitarian response project there, the community-led emergency action and response program, which has a couple of other ways that we integrate TIA into the project itself. So we have dedicated staffing to support safe and accountable programming, and it, as well as a multi-sector locally led project. So this too, being a locally led response means that the process of identifying the priorities and building that response with our local partners is the response itself in many ways. Yes, there are additional goods and additional things that go with it to support life-saving, activities. But this method is slightly slower than traditional humanitarian assistance, where you can just bring in materials and goods and give it to a community, but has really kind of flipped who is in the driver's seat and has taken a much more, I would argue, trauma responsive approach. So that's a couple of examples within projects itself, but we also need to look at organizations when we're talking about trauma-informed and trauma-responsive approaches, as Dr. Angi also mentioned. So Global Communities has an organizational commitment to mental health for our staff, and that is embedded within our duty of care policies. We offer trauma-informed training for managers and teams, particularly those who are working in fragile and conflict-affected areas. And then we also aim to provide contextually relevant specialized services to our staff itself, who are experiencing acute onset or protracted crises. We have a commitment to also understanding then how that works within our organization and learning and adapting from what we have been applying. So through direct discussions, through real-time reviews and after action reviews, we've been examining the perceptions of the support that's available to staff and adjusting as needed. So just to kind of show an example of this as well. For quite a long time, as an organization, we've offered mental health support through our employee assistance program. And in the early days of the Syria response, we were making sure that people knew about it, and it turned out it was not available in Arabic. We quickly rectified that, and of course now do have it in Arabic as well. And so that is a resource that over time more people have used. After the earthquake in Turkey last year, we ensured that we had, that same kind of mental health support in Arabic and Turkish as well. And then also really worked closely with our frontline staff in Syria, where we do have protection programming, to ensure that we were integrating staff well-being and care for carers modules into kind of our training and regular PSS approaches. After the earthquake, though, in particular, we were really in tune with what our staff were able to manage as they were dealing with trauma themselves, and brought in consultants to take on some of that work in order to take it off of their shoulders during this time of acute stress, acute crisis, so that we were able to give them a little more space to heal, to cope, to do what they needed to do. And just one other example that I'll bring up here too is, with the ongoing current conflict in Gaza, we are an organization that in West Bank and Gaza has worked with US government funding for a long time. And there's, I think everyone can recognize how politicized the situation is in West Bank and Gaza right now. And so there's a lot of moral injury, I think, happening among development and humanitarian practitioners who do work on programs that are largely institutionally funded from government donors, where suddenly there is very much a feeling that they are just objects and tools of foreign policy. So we had offered this kind of mental health support to our staff in both West Bank and Gaza, which was largely, not, the reaction was a bit indifferent, I would say. But then working with leadership, we realized that a lot of the staff there really wanted to learn about how to apply trauma-informed approaches within their own management of staff. So the particularly, staff in West Bank who are working with colleagues in Gaza wanted to be better managers to support their staff there. And so that's a way in which we were able to kind of socialize mental health support and provide it in a way that was culturally appropriate and welcome by people doing the hard work. So just to wrap up a couple of points, there are opportunities and barriers to trauma-informed and trauma-responsive approaches in both humanitarian and development work. Dr. Angi mentioned checklists as well as being, a tool that is used, and it is one that can be used as a way to establish a baseline and a common language, a way to do a quick measure of how things have been implemented, but insufficient. And I would argue that there is a great opportunity for, again, kind of looking at these myriad cross-cutting guidance that have this common thread of the humanity, the human lived experience, and kind of paring that down so that people who are practitioners in particularly complex areas are able to better synthesize all of this into their project cycles. I think there's an opportunity to move the needle on TRA through looking at it as both a project and an organization responsibility, and finding those specific entry points within the context and the organization that exists. And I think also in humanitarian assistance, there are a number of approaches that exist already and could be developed and put into to support development and stabilization approaches as well as using that to feedback on what isn't working for humanitarian assistance. So, just to say that, when we're looking at these complex situations, trauma, it's essential to include trauma informed approaches and trauma responsive approaches and move towards that. But until we are able to define what is a priority, when everything is a priority, nothing is a priority. So the more we can kind of hone in on that, I think the better we'll be at making it applied in ongoing responses and operations. I will leave it there.
Great. Thank you so much, Patricia. There was a lot in there, and I really appreciate your way of synthesizing this and looking at it both from the project side, from the sort of organizational side, and really honing in on this idea that has actually been a theme in the last few dialogues that we've done, where it's trying to find those cross-cutting overlaps and those mutually reinforcing principles that have to be applied and have to be actionable when you're on the ground delivering assistance, when you're on the ground dealing with such complexity, and you have to make it approachable. So definitely would like to explore that more. Pivoting on to our final speaker, Yasar Fattoom, who is speaking to us from Erbil. And Yasar, I really love it if you could really ground us in the realities of working in conflict-affected areas, and talk about the role that you see trauma playing, and maybe sort of referencing some of these points that the first speakers made. So over to you, Yasar.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Talking about trauma in 10 minutes only by itself is traumatizing enough, I have to say. But Angie and Patricia already hit on many points I wanted to say, actually. So just like Angie like to visualize, I like to tell stories. So allow me to start with a very short story of something happened with me a couple of weeks ago. I was in a side visit to an area in Iraq called Sinjar. And for those who don't know, Sinjar is the home of the Yazidi religious minorities. And where in 2014, ISIS came and massacred thousands of them, kidnapped thousands of women, raped women, and displaced hundreds of thousands of the Yazidis. And as we were driving into the district, our program coordinator, who is also Yazidi, he would stop the car off-road a little bit and point at a piece of land like really marked by a few rocks. And he said, Yasar, there, this is one of 83 mass graves where ISIS basically executed hundreds of our beloved ones, dumped their bodies in this hole and like covered it with sand. And since 2017, we are still waiting for someone to come and take out the bodies and bury them with dignity. I stood there literally not knowing how to react to what he said. Few days later, I would go to another province in Anbar, center west of Iraq, and there I would meet two women with their 6 children who happened to be the wives of ISIS fighters. The same criminals who basically did the genocide in Sinjar. And these two women were explaining to me how they lived for years in Al-Hol camp in northeast of Syria with their kids, and how their families had literally to sell everything they have to pay a human trafficker to smuggle them inside a fruit refrigerator truck from Iraq to Syria. And then they started to explain how basically they had no choice in joining ISIS because they had to follow the decisions of their husbands. And now that they are back in their communities, they face bullying and stigmatization on a daily basis for crimes that they literally have nothing to do with. As you walk in both districts, Sinjar and Anbar, you will see dozens of banners and billboards branding and marking the work of donors and international organizations that nowadays their sole job in Iraq is to bring these communities together and force them to coexist again. Needless to say, if you look at the programming that is being done for that matter, and if you see what percentage the trauma-focused programming is just a fraction of what like every other programming we are doing. If you look at the trauma-informed programming is really near zero. And this is not because we as like donors or implementers do not want or we don't care about the trauma of the communities where we work. It's because just like what Patricia mentioned, programs like ours are not designed by well-informed and great minds like Angie and Patricia, but rather by program managers like me, who really often find myself or my colleagues obliged to implement foreign policy priorities, whether that is stabilization, early recovery, peace building, you name it. But not having the time, the capacity to explore new tools and approaches that can help us be more effective in our response to the trauma of the communities where we work. And we only recently started to realize that achieving this foreign policy objective are not really genuine or sustainable without healing the communities where we work. And the sad result of that is that we ended up with normalizing trauma as part of the job that we do. We basically accepted the trauma as a historical reality of these communities where we work, which is not only untrue, but it's also build a barrier between us and achieving the results we would like to achieve. How do we change that reality? If you ask me, my answer is literally I don't know, but I can tell you about observations or things that we think it might help. The first of it is understanding trauma. When I was hearing basically both communities, how they are talking about it, both communities, they have received 2-3 months of PTSD training or a psychosocial support, mental health, or CVE for the kids. But does it work? Not really, because when you meet with them, they don't tell you about the schools we rehab. They don't tell you about the water stations we fix. They point at mass graves and they tell you about the bullying that they face in schools and in their communities. In my humble opinion, I think it is time for us to embrace a trauma-responsive approach as a culture, not as a separate line of effort. Meaning, it's not a box that we need to tick. It is a culture. It is an approach that we need to incorporate in literally every type of programming that we do, and that really requires the collaboration of not only like us as practitioners, but literally every decision makers in the chain, and starting from DC, from the people who basically decide where the money goes. Only when donors and people who allocate the money acknowledge the importance of healing communities where we work from their trauma, only when they highlight as a criteria for evaluation of program performance or like how to award task order, only then implementers will wake up to the reality that, oh, this is important and we need to equip our programs. And this is like Angi, you mentioned this, like we need to equip our programs and our staff with the capacity and skills that enable them to basically incorporate a trauma-responsive approach in the programming that we do. Embracing it as a culture not only allow us to do our job better, but it help us also to channel this approach and knowledge to our local partners. And I think, Patricia, you also talked about that. And this is extremely important. Our local partners are our messengers, and they are the one who knows what works and what doesn't work, and in terms of healing their community. I don't want to be seeing like depicting a gloomy black picture, because there is also a few baby steps that I have recently observed in our world that probably the intention behind them is not trauma related, but I definitely see the relevance here. One of them, and one of the speakers also mentioned the localization. The concept of localization now is gaining importance in our world, and I see this important because when you put local staff in the program leadership positions, you're not only basically able to understand the trauma better, but you are also able to build the trust with the community. And this trust is essential and is vital for the success of a trauma-responsive approach in the programming. Other things, I see more louder voices talking about the importance of having psychological safety. And that's whether basically within the workspace for people to talk about the trauma. We often forget that our staff actually comes from the communities and they were exposed to tragedies and traumatized just like the community. But it also enables like an open and transparent dialogue between us and our partners, which help us basically adjust our programming to be more trauma responsive. Last thing I want to mention is that this is not really like a nice to have thing anymore. Like using a trauma responsive approach is not a nice thing to have. It is a must. And just like Patricia said, like if you ever have a doubt about that, look at Gaza now in 2024, and you get the answer why this is like really a must have in our programming. And I will stop there. I hope I didn't go over time.
Thank you, Yasar. As always, that was very insightful, and I think gave us a lot to think about. I really appreciate you giving that example of how localization can really achieve, us moving to this space and showing us how these themes overlap. So we've now ended the sort of formal presentations from all three speakers. So I encourage the audience to pop questions in the chat. But before we go there, I'll sort of start with one, and I'll hand it to any of our speakers that want to take it. And it's a theme that you mentioned, Yasar, towards the end, and it's maybe more signaling or more demand from donors to elevate these issues, and how that would sort of change this community and maybe have implementers be a bit more responsive. And I wanted to sort of throw out there a question: what, in your opinion, have donors done right here, and what could they improve? And in particular, thinking about, oftentimes in stabilization programming or early recovery, we talk about sort of the hard elements of stabilization, and then we talk about social recovery, which in some ways can almost be this approach. Do you think we've been, trying to approach this with sort of other terms? Are there sort of examples that you could say that sort of get us to a trauma-informed approach, even if it wasn't called that? Or just an overall statement on what do you think donors have done right, and what do you think they could do to improve our sort of progress in this space? So Angie, it looks like you're talking. If you come off mute.
I'm talking to myself. But I think one of the places where I saw USAID, let's call it out as USAID, do something right was in East Africa. And about, as I said, I was running around USAID as the trauma lady, always talking, went out of USAID, went into an implementing partner. And we started to pilot this. Like, there was no language for it. We've changed language, we've moved, and we keep thinking so deeply about language because it's so important. But what happened was that the USAID folks who started to see this, and they saw the change and transformation within communities, became like really like they got it, and it got interwoven into USAID programs throughout East Africa. And as these USAID folks also left and went to other places, they took that with them. And so just listening and hearing and, allowing people to innovate around this. And we were peace builders. We were not psychologists. We were not, definitely were not psychiatrists. We were not mental health experts. We were just, peace builders on the front line in local communities with local folks who were there. And there were no mental health experts, and there were no people who were, the experts to deal with this. So we had to figure out how to do it, because it wasn't an answer to say, there's oftentimes this thing of like, well, you'll re-traumatize people. And I know re-traumatization is a tenet of trauma-informed practice, but I think that as outside Westerners, we put too much emphasis on what people who are from the place will experience, and we don't let it be led by people. And what USAID did was let it be led by local communities. So as we experimented, they were the ones pushing us to constantly move and change our language and change our practice. So that innovative space is really important, and not a space where it says, no, you can't talk about that because you're not the experts. It was really, really important. And I know I shout out to Wendy Marshall, if anybody knows her, but she really embodied this and led this and helped kind of bring it into kind of a lot of programming in East Africa.
Thank you. Anyone else want to speak on that? Okay. Well, we'll turn to the Q&A. And thank you for those that have submitted your questions. I'll read one, and then maybe either Patricia or Yasar, if you want to comment on it. So this one is from Shauna. She asks, we know that today's traumas are the root of tomorrow's conflicts. So how do we start with us as individuals working in development who've been exposed to vicarious and secondary trauma? Beyond capacity building and skills, what are initiatives, programs, and ways we should invest in providing mental health and trauma-related support to ourselves and our staff, who often come directly from the community? And as you said, Yasar, many who have experienced trauma in their own lives. Any thoughts on that?
I'm gonna answer that as someone who basically has been exposed to like a secondary trauma working in Iraq and the primary trauma being a Syrian. So from both sides, I think a lot of implementers, just like global communities, Patricia, you mentioned, like offer kind of mental health services or like consulting for their staff. Honestly, I don't know, like this is definitely like an important step, but you need to remember that we work in communities that mental health is not like accepted socially all the time. In the Middle East, you need to have a courage basically to talk that, hey, I'm not feeling well. So that need to be absolutely complemented by, like I said before, promoting it as a culture, making it part of our normal and daily life. If you're not feeling well, there is someone to talk to. If your staff are burnt out, it's not a pizza day. It's much more than that. Like to offer them. In my opinion, basically, the more we emphasize the importance of psychological safety and to promote this as a culture, it might take some time for the team and the work dynamic to get used to it. But once you have it, it definitely changes the whole working dynamic and the spirit around.
Oh, can I build on that a little bit? Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that formal mental health supports are one tool and certainly not the be all end all. I actually, I'm a firm believer that supports for mental health and psychological safety take a variety of forms, whether that is flexible work schedules or, flexible work locations, depending on what your role is and what needs to be carried out. I'm a firm believer in localization processes and trying to put decision making in the hands of communities as much as possible. I will say, though, I think that this is a place where in some contexts, having a roster where you can bring in external people who are not dealing with the immediate trauma, the primary trauma themselves for in the limited period of time can be helpful. One example for that, again, is like in the wake of the earthquake in Turkey. Now, that's not a conflict scenario, which we've primarily been talking about, but when you have people, when your own staff and your staff members who are trying to deliver programs are wondering where they're going to sleep that night, it is useful to have people who don't have that concern, who can step in and help deliver your programs while people are able to find their way through this traumatic event that they have been in.
I'd like to give one example. A couple years ago, IOM Northeastern Nigeria, working in 8 field offices, approached us and said, our teams don't want to talk about mental health. They're greatly affected. We have low staff morale. Funding goes up and down as usual cycles. What can you do? And we said, well, we have a virtual online circle space. This is very African, may not work anywhere else in the world, but it really has taken a hold in the programming that we do across Africa. And we trained 14 of their staff to be circle keepers virtually on WhatsApp for people who were drivers, cooks. Mohammed Abbas, who is one of our circle keepers, I mean, he should be on like Nollywood or something, but for Northeastern Nigeria, he would translate it into Hausa, the little small videos that we would send. They loved it because it was East African voices. It was African images. It felt right to them. They didn't have to talk about it being mental health. They just talked about it as their circle. And it changed how the organization they talked about how the organization cared about them and their families in new ways that they never even understood, but they did the work. And I think if you look at WHO's service of provision for mental health, at the bottom, you'll see a huge percentage of self-care and community care. And community care is that foundational piece where the peer support comes into. And it's what we've developed our processes around, because this is collective, it's not individual. The other thing that I'm doing at Florida State right now is creating organizational certification around trauma awareness. Really interested in getting this to the development partners to get trauma aware is the first step. I'll move to the next programs using probably a program that uses nonviolent communication to the trauma-informed and responsive piece. But these will be organizational tools that I hope can really be put to use for the large organizations who are doing this work all over the world. And I think I continue to work on both of those. The peer support, we're building an app so that it can be more accessible. We can have different languages, but we're also continuing to do this organizational certification, which gets that initial awareness, like you talked about, Yasar, as an important first step that gets the conversation and the language built for the entire team, whether in your headquarters or you're in the field or wherever you are.
Thank you for that. I think very, helpful ways of looking at this. So we don't have a ton of time, but there are a couple of questions here that I'd sort of like to combine and get your feedback on. It's, one question on sort of how implementers and or donors may be monitoring and measuring results on current sort of the impact of trauma-informed approaches, and are there ways to identify which are more effective? And then another question about, from the sort of DC perspective, how to help move the needle on this more and see trauma-informed approaches as something that's like baked into the program cycle, as opposed to some afterthought that happens after stabilization or peace building program, hits the ground. And so any thoughts on how to show quicker results or indicators to show progress on it, as some of these longer, more sort of communal healing practices may take longer to show results. So any thoughts from our speakers?
That's a workshop on itself. We've spent the last 10 years looking at how to measure this, how to build this into everything that we do, every place that we work. In East Africa, we probably have about 10 years of data from 4 or 5 countries in conflict, including with the Kenyan police. And we haven't published enough. And because we haven't published, it's not being done, but we're trying to change that this year. But it's really, really important to build that expertise and use that to shape how the programs evolve and where you put your emphasis. All of our data has helped us reshape and retone our tools and our interventions every time that we've done it. So we've had a very reflective piece to it, but I can't answer that question because it's too much.
Understandable. Yeah. Great. And we had a couple more questions come in. I just want to, recognize, one from Ahmed, who's asking about any examples that could help the recovery in Derna after the major flood, where many lost their lives, and sort of how to sort of apply this to overcome some of that sort of communal trauma that results from a natural disaster. And then another from people around Tigray affected by trauma in Ethiopia, and if there was any sort of contributions that you think could be relevant there. So to give the time for those last couple speakers, if there's any comments on those last 2 questions.
I don't have like a technical answer to that because like I'm not a therapist or a psychiatrist for that matter. But I learned one lesson is that some communities they know how to heal themselves better than an outsider telling them how. They just need to be enabled to do that. They need to be enabled, given the time, the space, the tools that they need to go through the process. And I give you an example in Sinjar. we don't go to people there and we try to talk to them about mental health. We actually figured out if there are local initiatives of women who survived the rape and the sexual abuse and the kidnapping experience, and they healed themselves. And now we support them to help others. That's like I don't know if it's called like peer-to-peer support, basically. I found that to be like a very effective approach in local communities. I hope that helps, but I really don't have a direct answer.
Great.
Yeah, I would say a similar sort of answer, where I don't have the expertise to say specifically either, but you know, we've similarly found with really difficult topics, you know, you have to find the entry point that people are able to talk about. And so for one example, when we're working with parenting groups in communities, that's a way where we can start to introduce ideas around mental health and trauma responsiveness, trauma-informed parenting, because people are there to support each other on their parenting journey, but we don't necessarily name it as, how do you help your traumatized child, right? And how do you help yourself as a traumatized parent? It's providing the space for them to come around safe topics and kind of introduce those ideas more subtly. But again, that may be look very different in different contexts. This example I'm giving is in Syria, but it may look very different in different contexts.
Great. Thank you so much for that. And unfortunately, we're out of time for today's conversation, just above the hour. I want to thank you all for participating and for our panelists for this very rich discussion. There are many takeaways here. As I think Angie was saying, there's an entire seminar unto itself with just one of the points that was raised. But I'd like to just highlight a few of the themes that emerged for me. One is, I think, this real connection that this is not a siloed approach. This is not a technical approach that can be sort of put on top of a program. Rather, it's a frame of reference, and it's a way of looking at the innate strengths, resiliencies, and power in communities, and really finding and harnessing that sort of communal healing and that perspective that exists in the communities that we're working, and really sort of putting the focus back on, the communities, as you just said, Yasar, they're enabled to heal themselves, and we have to sort of harness that and find it. And that's one, I think, perspective that definitely jumped out here. And then I think another one is really realizing the complexity of this. There are no straightforward answers. There's no box to check or pathway to follow. It's going to manifest itself differently in different communities. But I think some of these approaches that our speakers highlighted today certainly have hopefully offered our audience some ways to think about that. And I really, again, want to thank you all for joining us today for this really important discussion. And I hope you got as much out of it as we did. And let's thank our speakers, and I wish you all a good day or evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much.